Okay, let's be real here. How many sales guru articles do you read? Or courses do you take in an effort to hone your craft and get better? And when you do hear something that's intellectually intriguing, how consistent are you with experimenting with it and using it in your real conversations? For example, how about moving off or stopping that temptation to wanting or needing to be liked or validated? Have you ever thought through these pursuits and how they actually hold you back? Like you, I've learned the hard way that it's crucial to track this tendency, and that taking those first few leaps of faith and emphasizing your questions and learning over sharing your expertise and being liked isn't easy. In this conversation, Tim Filewicz shares his journey from seeking to be liked and needing validation from his prospects to trusting his peer-to-peer mindset and developing his executive poise in his conversations. You'll learn how we embrace the process of developing a healthy level of detachment so we could call on C-suite executives, solve more complex problems, and go further up market. More importantly, you'll hear how he learned to perform in high-pressure sales situations when everything was on the line. If you're ready to learn how to trust the feeling of uncertainty and discomfort so you can raise your game, listen in. Yeah, Tim, so I wanted you on the podcast because I know it's the beginning of a new year for so many people, right? And everybody makes these resolutions, or they set these new goals, right? And they talk about how this year is going to be different for them and all that. But when I look back on the work that I've seen you do on yourself and on your business, on your craft, I see the work you've done with your mindset, and I've seen the work you've done with the process, and most importantly, how you've learned to trust the discomfort, how you've learned to trust doing something different in a high pressure situation. And so I thought it'd be really great to bring you on today so you can share some of those stories and share some of that journey with our listeners. So, not trying to put you on the spot, but hopefully it could be kind of profound today.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Dan. And I say the good part for us is that we're halfway through January, so we technically made it through Quitter's Day. So anyone that's hopefully potentially listening to this pod is still trusting their process and working on their own evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of let's flash back a little bit. Say 2-3 years ago. What was a priority back then when you were thinking about business development, selling, and building your business? What were the priorities that you focused on back then?
Yeah, I just think naturally where I was from a priority perspective in any deal was the relationship aspect. And I unfortunately always just put the value of the relationship being the most critical component of where I was in an opportunity. And as I've worked for the last 2.5 years, I would say that the biggest takeaway is potentially is that sometimes relationship, believe it or not, could be an inhibitor, right? It could actually be blocking you from putting yourself in a position to be calm, to show conviction, to be empathetic. And where you are in your conversation from a relationship perspective to where you are and coming in and being completely detached and relaxed is completely different.
I know relationship is a very interesting word. The best way to look at it, right, is like, how did you define it back then? When you think about relationship, say 3 years ago, how did you define relationship?
I think the relationship aspect, unfortunately, linked too much to like solution selling. I would go automatically into a prospect meeting or a coffee meeting with someone. And because I had the relationship equity, I was actually just in one lane, right? I was blocking myself from being curious, from presenting myself to ask challenging questions or to kind of get into the understanding of realizing that this conversation may not actually even need an additional conversation. At the time, there may not be a reason for me to even help or even work with the prospect. And when you go into these initial, I would say, conversations with the relationship controlling 80, 90% of where you are in the meeting, you're missing all those conversation components.
Yeah, when you say relationship, that's interesting. When you say relationship control, does that mean like you were allowing the perception of the relationship to kind of control what you did and what you didn't do?
Yeah, 100%. I would just think that because I had the relationship, I was entitled to getting the deal. Like, how long is that? And you get in this position where the conversation was probably so generic in the sense that we would talk about the relationship. We wouldn't even talk about the business. You know, if there's a connection between someone that may have introduced me to the prospect, or there was a way that we connected through common individuals, relationships, etc., we would spend more time enriched in that aspect of the conversation that we wouldn't even kind of get into the business. And the weird part is that I would actually leave the meeting and think that that was a good meeting because I spent more time talking about the connections or the people that I knew, the name dropping or how there was relationship equity. And leaving there knowing that the conversation was just about that would give me like this sense of pride or this feeling that it was actually meaningful or impactful. And it was completely wrong.
That's not an easy thing for, I think, any of us to come to an assessment of or come to a conclusion, right? Where we think, you know what? I'm kind of spending a lot of my time seeking to be liked, or I'm spending a lot of my energy trying to validate myself, either through who I know, what I know, where I've been, right? That's hard to do. Like, how did you get there where you kind of did that self-evaluation and you were like, yeah, this isn't really working, or it's not working at the level I want it to?
Ultimately, what happens is that humility has to overtake the sense of embarrassment, right? Because where you are in the embarrassing aspect sometimes blocks or deters you from getting to that next level of being humble in the sense that I actually need to work. I need to figure out where I am in these conversations. And if I look back to everything we just talked about from a relationship equity point, I would say if 2.5 years ago, if you modeled my 5 years, the common theme in all my conversations was me, right? Like I was the guy having these meetings, having these conversations. And I was lucky if 20% of them would move to the next level. And if you reflect on that and you look at your humility, you realize that there must be something going on in the conversations with me that's not getting me to that next level. And I would say putting yourself out there and completely removing the component of being embarrassed in the sense that you need work is kind of the best starting point. Because if you want to push yourself to that high performance or evolve and create a process, the humility and the trust that you're going to put in yourself up front is what's going to create the pathway for you to actually start and take off.
So there's so many questions I could ask, Tim, and I will, because I do want to get to how you developed, number one, this mindset that you now have. And I want you to share some stories with our listeners on that and how it's driven your conversations, but also like how you trusted it and how you learned to trust that mindset and trust that shift in your conversations. But at the same time, like, what would you say to our listeners who are very technical, right? They do have a lot of experience. They do have a lot of competency when it comes to solution selling, right? What would you say to them to help them start to really think about the success of that approach so they could start questioning it and maybe start thinking about, not leading with competency?
Solution selling does come in, right? There is a point when you're going to have to transition into solution selling. I feel that, however, where I was wrong and where sometimes people kind of block themselves in is the fact that we initially go into these meetings where we want our solution to come in up front. And we're automatically either judging or labeling a prospect in the sense that we have the answer. We feel we know where we want this kind of conversation to get to. And when you operate in that format, or when you propose your questions to the prospect in that light, I just don't feel that the genuine approach or the empathy is there, in the sense of really trying to get to understand or uncover some of the obstacles or hurdles that a prospect may be facing. What's going on in their business, right? Where's the conviction of really trying to unpack how you potentially can help? Because the solution selling always comes off in the sense that you can help. That's not accurate, right? There may be a time where you may not be able to help, and that's totally okay. And accepting that fact is realistic.
Well, think about this, right? How many times have you had the answers to the test? You sat in front of your prospect over the years. They've shared a couple things with you, and you know you got the answers to the test. You know how to solve what they just shared. And so you share it, but nothing different happens.
And I'll even go one deeper. How many times do you go in where you want your questions to reveal the answers to those tests? Because you're trying to drive the conversation to warrant your benefit. That's not really consultative. That's not being in the moment of being detached, being curious, being opportunistic, in the sense that you're just there to learn if you can help. And if you can help, that's great. But if you can't, that's great too, because you still should be able to sit down and just have a great conversation in the sense of trying to unpack what's really going on inside an organization.
We're talking about competency, which a lot of our listeners have and cherish, and I get it. We're talking about relationship, which we all know is important, right? The trust that you need to have for someone to make a change to you needs to be pretty high, right? And we're talking about curiosity and asking questions. I'm just curious if you can think back. What was it like the first time, or maybe it was one of the first times that you caught yourself in that situation where you had the answers to the test and you knew traditionally this would be the time to challenge with your competency or share your competency, and you held back and you asked more questions?
Yeah, so I think what's the old me, right, was that was what I would call like the pounce moment. You're like, all right, I got him, right? The truth came out. I could tell this guy that he's wrong. And then he realized, it's like, well, wait a minute. Why do I want to tell him he's wrong or she's wrong? Why can't we just go a little bit deeper and try to understand, well, why have you actually been doing it that way? Help me kind of learn and educate me on why you feel that strategy has impacted the business. And then just kind of sit there and listen. And then circle back and be like, well, have you actually ever thought about doing it this way? And if you did do it this way, what are you risking? What are you gaining? How do you see that this outcome maybe is successful over the next 12 months? And again, I just feel for the change and kind of that evolution and learning to stick to my process is that when you know an answer, you actually shouldn't give the answer, right? That's the best time to ask more questions, because at the end, when you leave that meeting, those moments are probably going to give you the best opportunity from an educational perspective, where you're truly learning how someone is processing information and how they're thinking about outcomes.
Describe a little bit the trust factor that goes into trusting that, right? Because I know our listeners have all been there, and I've been there in the past and all that, right? Where, again, you're in that split moment where the traditional, typical you would share the solution, share the idea. But then you somehow decided, nope, I need to ask more here. What's that moment like? How do you get through that the first couple times?
Dude, it's super hard, right? And I would say what separates, in my experience, the best salespeople that I've been around are the ones that have that innate ability to kind of transition to that, what I call like their intent zone, because 8 out of 10 people are going to try to jump in and capitalize and be like, listen, this is my solution. This is how you should be doing this. This is why I want you to do this. And you just miss that window from an intent perspective of creating true empathy or curiosity in a situation to sit there and figure out, all right, this might be the opportunity to determine how and if I can actually help you, or how and if we could actually work together. And if you just take that pause, remain calm, detach yourself, sit back, and drive in with another question, I guarantee you your prospect is sitting there on the other side of the table being like, you know what? This person is really trying to truly understand and potentially help me come up with a better solution.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, Tim. Like, so how do you typically see the prospects respond when you don't leap right away and you kind of settle down a little bit and you continue to ask more questions? What kind of different responses or observations have you made?
So if we go back to how we kind of kicked off, where I was just relationship equity driven, where I've now learned that I was always in the friend zone. The impact of the conversation from then to now is truly where you stay in the process, right? That's where your systems help become your goals. Because ultimately what happens is that you can really evaluate what's going on, or more importantly, you can adopt the growth mindset in that moment to really realize that there are true things here from a communication perspective that need to take place. Or more importantly, this is where the solution selling is advantageous in the sense of being beneficial to asking questions.
You said something about the friend zone. What was that like, that getting out of the friend zone and allowing yourself to get out of the friend zone, right? Because that's a tough one. Human nature is, right? We're very social creatures. And whether you're introvert, extrovert, you have that social need to be accepted, right? To be liked, right? To be part of the pack. So, well, getting out of the friend zone, what was that like?
Yeah, so you want to talk about challenging your self-awareness, right? The humble pie of realizing that everybody doesn't have to be your friend. There actually doesn't have to be a common connection to generate a good conversation. And I've learned through my work and kind of like this evolution of kind of working day in and day out on my mindset and where I am in terms of development, is that the friend aspect always blocked me. And we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, probably in depth, in the sense that the old me from a prep perspective was very lax in the sense that I felt that I could prioritize the relationship compared to prioritizing learning. And the friend zone, innately, like you just put it, from a human perspective, we all want to be accepted. We all want the warmth. We think that we need to have this conversation in the sense that it's driven purely through the mechanics of knowing people. And it's just a miss. And I don't want anyone to come off think that I'm judging or labeling that perspective, but I think if you work through that and can accept the criticism of the conduct of your behaviors of getting out of that, you're already going to see success in terms of how you develop.
So you mentioned prep. I wanted to ask you about that anyways. Prior to like 2 or 3 years ago, how did you prep for a meeting? I know you'll be blunt and honest. And then how does that compare?
There was no prep, Dan.
Okay.
It was show up. I called it show up and throw up, right? I'd show up. I'd try to talk 80% of the time. I didn't really kind of ask questions, just truthfully. I was just there to have a conversation. It was as social as it could possibly be. And I realized that got me to a great point, but it also got me really stale. And it got me in a position where my business wasn't getting to the next level. And from a self-reflection standpoint, I put a lot of pressure on myself, thinking, hey, was I not good enough? B, why aren't these things happening? And both of those responses are inaccurate in the sense that, yeah, I am good enough, but it's not happening because I'm not approaching these the right way, right? I go in now, it's the priorities are the sense that in the upfront agreement or the conversation about why we're there to connect with one another is really going to level set in the sense that you're not there to label, you're not there to judge, you're really there to discover and learn. And through the discovery and learning of the conversation through the questions, you are going to get to a point where you figure out if it actually makes sense to work with one another, or if it even needs an additional conversation or an additional conversation after that conversation. That's all good. The outcomes are good either way. And I realize now that there are bad meetings. Okay. I still make plenty of mistakes. The old priority was that I felt like I had to leave that meeting with a designated response in the sense that this is what we were going to do next. Okay. That was the impact for me. That's how I felt like it was a success. Conversations now should be forthgoing. You should learn. You should have the opportunity to further connect, to figure out how they're thinking through some of the conversation topics that you had in the meeting, et cetera.
So I'm going to share with the listeners one of your experiences, okay? And then I want to talk about how you prep your mindset, and if you could give specifics to the listeners. But Tim, I remember not too long ago, it's within the past year, right? You lost a really large client. I mean, I think it was $800K annually. But then you also fought back and you won new business, I think at 1.1 or 1.2 million. That's pretty special given the fact that, right, any one of us losing an 800K client, boy, right, you could fetal right away and cry ourselves to sleep for many nights in a row and lament and never maybe rebound, but you did.
Yep.
So can you share with our listeners, and that's all in the past year, can you share with our listeners the work you put in? Because sometimes it's not sexy. So talk about the mindset work each and every day, the mindset specifically each and every day that you would really try to just keep building off of to get yourself, out of that rut back to where you wanted to be.
For sure. That loss was brutal. And it's still in the back of the mind. And I have my moments where I want to scream, kick, punch, go ballistic about it. But I've gotten to this point where I realize that there's not one meeting or one client, either in a win or a loss, that are going to define the longevity of my career. And my takeaway in that is you do somehow have to find the value in the loss. And the value in that loss from a mindset perspective is that I had an opportunity when that happened to completely shut it down and go back to the old me where the priorities were, what did I do wrong? Why did this happen to me? What could I have done better? And I think from where I am in my perspective of my mindset now is that loss, leading into that loss, I know that I did absolutely everything right. I practiced, I worked with you individually in the sense of when I get to that table, the whole conversation is about the client. It's not centered around me. It's not centered around my team. It's really about the relationship aspect of how we help you grow and scale. And sitting there in those meetings with the perspective and the mindset of knowing that you are a C-suite executive and that you are at the table having those meetings should give you enough confidence to realize that when you walk out of there, if you did everything you're supposed to do and you win or lose, it's still not going to define you.
Yeah, I think if I remember back, and I know this will help the listeners, when you were going through that, you did prep a lot. You did. You were very discerning and you were very deliberate so that when you were going to have a conversation with that client and or your team, you were prepping your questions. But what you also prepped, I remembered, was what do you need to be prepared to ask? Right? Which was always those tougher questions. And I remember that you did a lot of prep on those where you would sit back and you would be thinking, okay, here's what we're probably going to cover. Here's what's going to come up. Here's those 2, 3, or 4 really tough questions. When it came time to ask them, great, because it's one thing to prep for them. When it came time to ask them in the heat of the moment, whether it was with the CFO, right, or the risk manager, or right, CEO, or whatever, how did you just embrace that moment?
So I think the biggest kind of change in terms of the prioritizing where my focus was is that I actually didn't want to leave that meeting feeling like I should have said something differently. I wanted to be prepared in knowing that I was in a competitive situation and I had to come off in the sense that win or lose in the competition, my questions and thoughts were thinking about what is best for the client. And sometimes in those competitive scenarios, you realize that posing those questions is actually going to give you the credibility. And if I look back over the last 2.5 years since the work process, in the beginning, Dan, I was actually afraid to ask those questions. I thought it was wrong to challenge a client or a prospect to think differently. I thought it was wrong in the sense that the competitive tension in those minutes would put me in a negative light. And I was way wrong, because what I'm trying to do in those situations with a prospect or a current client is to get them to think. And sometimes I'm actually paid to be a consultant to make you think a little bit differently. The hardship there is that the way you're thinking and the way that I'm thinking is that we're trying to come to a middle point. And to get there, that comes through those challenging moments. But the trust and the evolution of getting to that point to ask them is what's going to help you gain the credibility in the long term and help you learn the most.
So yeah, Tim, if you can you share a story?
Yeah, I think a great story, Dan, from a peer-to-peer perspective in regards to I would say a challenged relationship where there was a lot of tension, in the sense that I had a client where there was a difference of opinion at the table in terms of the C-suite's perceptions or where we were in the working relationship compared to where myself and my team were. And when we sat down at this meeting to have this conversation, I thought it was best to call the tension out in the beginning. And from a growth perspective, we kind of walked through this evolution and learning to trust yourself and to have the confidence in the mindset. The prep that went into that was that it was actually really good to call out the tension in the beginning. Because if we wanted to have a successful meeting or a successful conversation, we needed to level set with one another. And if I go a little bit deeper in that, when we sat down, the opening was that we've had a long-standing relationship with you for X amount of years. We've realized there's been some changes. The changes internally have put a little bit of stress on the relationship, but it'd be really good for us to understand where you feel the mistakes are taking place so that we can create a plan on the go forward. And if I didn't call that out or have the confidence and the mindset to be upfront and direct, there was going to be problems in that meeting.
All right, as we wrap things up, I want to ask you a critical question. What conversations are you avoiding because you're prioritizing the need for security and ease in the relationship versus clarity, progress, and impact? Tim's transformation started with humility and willingness to question his approach. He was willing to mess some things up in the short term to strengthen his long-term success. Remember, your conversations are the stage you now compete on. You get paid to quiet the voices that hold you back so you can listen to the voices that push you forward, and you can perform in the clutch.